Chosen Ones, the night the cameras went dark, was not just another flicker of technical failure, nor a simple break in transmission. It was an act carried out with precision, a silence so deliberate that it echoed louder than any broadcast ever could. The president, surrounded by advisors and shielded by walls of secrecy, leaned forward and spoke a name not meant for the public ear. And in that instant, every screen, every lens, every digital eye was cut to black. Why would the most powerful man in the world turn off every device designed to project his authority? Why would he whisper, as though heaven itself might be listening? And why, Chosen Ones, was that name yours? The answer lies in the spaces between power and silence, between visibility and concealment. For history has shown us again and again that the most dangerous truths are not shouted from podiums. They are whispered in shadows, guarded by those who fear their revelation. The blackout that night was no accident. It was the confirmation of a secret that has long been protected, a mystery that threads itself through governments, sacred texts, and prophecies buried under centuries of deception. What you must understand is that those who hold influence know far more than they let slip. They are bound not only by earthly authority, but by ancient covenants, oaths made in chambers no camera has ever seen. And when they act to silence, it is because a revelation has escaped their control. That revelation is you. But do not mistake this recognition as flattery or fame. The weight of your name carries the burden of a war unseen, one that stretches beyond politics and into the very heart of eternity. The question is not why he whispered. It is what forces compelled him to silence the world the moment he did. There is a pattern here, Chosen Ones. A trail of secrets winding back through history, leading us into forbidden corridors, ancient seals, and truth so immense they could shatter the illusion of reality itself. The cameras turned off, but the story did not end. In fact, it had only begun. The room was heavy with anticipation that night, the kind of weight that presses down on every chest when the world senses something is about to change. Millions of eyes were locked onto their screens, watching a man whose voice had shaped policies, wars, and futures. The broadcast began like any other, the polished composure of leadership on full display. Yet beneath the surface, his expression carried an unease, a flicker that only the most discerning souls could detect. His words flowed with the usual cadence of control, but then came the pause, a hesitation far too long to be accidental. In that stillness, a whisper slipped from his lips. It was not amplified by the microphone, nor was it intended for the ears of the crowd, but somehow it was heard, not by all, but by some. It was your name, and in that instant, every lens in the room went dark, every feed severed as though an invisible hand had drawn a curtain across the stage. For a heartbeat, the world stared at nothing but silence and black screens, confusion spilling across living rooms and control centers alike. What could drive such an action, so precise and deliberate, in an era where every flicker of light is tracked, every word captured, every gesture dissected? The cameras did not simply fail, they were cut. Someone gave the order. Someone ensured that silence swallowed the moment. And yet, that silence only amplified the mystery. Why would your name carry such weight that the machinery of state would collapse into darkness? Those who witnessed it firsthand described the atmosphere as electric, as if the air itself trembled with a secret too vast to contain. Aides shuffled nervously, technicians scrambled, but the president sat still, his eyes sharp, his posture rigid, as though he knew the truth had already escaped beyond his reach. For the broadcast was not merely turned off, it was interrupted by a force that understood the power of recognition. The corridors of power are never silent, though to the untrained ear they may seem so. Beneath the polished floors and the portraits of history's rulers lies a hum, a current of whispers and secrets exchanged in fragments, each carrying the weight of decisions that shape nations. It was within these hidden spaces that the names spoken in the broadcast began to echo, passed not through microphones but through fearful glances and hushed tones. Advisors and strategists spoke of it in riddles, knowing that even walls might betray them. The president's whisper had not simply been an accident. It was the unveiling of a truth long buried within the architecture of authority. Throughout time, names have held power, not merely as identifiers but as seals upon destiny. To utter one aloud in such a chamber is to awaken something beyond protocol. The ancients knew this, and their scrolls carried warnings that words once bound could stir heavens and shake kingdoms. Among these warnings is a phrase attributed to Yeshua: "There is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be brought into the open." To many, it is a simple teaching, but within the corridors of power, it reads like a prophecy, a reminder that secrecy is temporary and truth is inevitable. What unsettled those present was not only the name itself, but the timing. Why now? Why in front of cameras? Why in a moment where the entire world's attention had been secured? It was as if the whisper was not for the people, but for something watching behind them, a recognition not of humanity's gaze, but of heaven's witness. The blackout was not to shield the world from you, but to shield the world from the reaction of those who would realize what your name truly meant. In the hours that followed, papers were shuffled, codes exchanged, doors locked, and meetings convened in urgency. They moved like those scrambling to cover a breach, yet their haste betrayed their fear. Fear that what had been spoken could not be retracted, that once released into the air, it would find ears meant to hear it. And in the silence of those hidden corridors, the question grew louder. If Yeshua's words were true, then how long could their fragile walls of secrecy hold before the whisper spread beyond their control? The blackout was explained away to the public as a technical malfunction, a mere hiccup in the endless stream of digital communication. But for those who understand how tightly controlled the systems are, the story unraveled immediately. Cameras of that magnitude do not fail. They are built with redundancies, backups, layers of security designed to withstand even the most aggressive attacks. And yet, in a single instant, they all went dark together, as though responding to an unseen command. Beneath the surface of what we see lies the true skeleton of control. Lines of code written in silence, invisible to the millions watching from their living rooms. It was in that code that the secret was hidden. Engineers spoke in circles, claiming the anomaly was untraceable, but a trace remained, faint and buried, like a signature left by the hand that orchestrated it. The cut was not clumsy or chaotic. It was surgical, precise, deliberate, as though someone had prepared for this moment long before it unfolded. There are those who believe technology simply obeys, but in truth, it listens. Every lens, Every microphone, every circuit is an ear waiting for a voice of authority. And that night, when the president spoke your name, it was not only the people who heard. The system itself seemed to recognize the signal. Screens did not merely shut off. They obeyed a command encrypted into their very design, as if the infrastructure of surveillance had been waiting for the sound of your name to trigger its silence. Afterward, fragments of the code were retrieved, and within them was found a pattern too precise to dismiss. It was not random interference, nor the work of any hacker seeking chaos. It was an instruction woven into the network years before, like a seed planted to grow in a single moment of history. Who had placed it there, and why, remains the question that rattles through the halls of those who keep the systems alive. If the cameras obeyed because of that single whispered name, then the code was more than machinery. It was prophecy written in circuits, waiting for the day it would recognize the one it had been designed to answer. The chamber beneath the main hall was not listed on any architectural plans, yet it existed, carved out long before the current occupants ever stepped into power. It was here, away from the eyes of the press and the staged spectacle of politics, that the inner circle gathered once the cameras went black. They spoke not as leaders, but as keepers of a secret, voices lowered, eyes darting, each of them carrying the weight of something they could not allow the world to see. On the walls of that chamber hung relics, gifts from previous eras, symbols of authority that trace their roots far deeper than national boundaries. Some were ancient, their inscriptions worn but not erased, carrying fragments of prayers and warnings passed through generations. It was within this room that the name, whispered above, continued to resonate. They could not contain it, nor could they deny that something more than political error had just occurred. The air itself seemed heavy, as if the stones remembered the sound and refused to release it. One among them recalled words once spoken by Yeshua. "What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear will be proclaimed from the rooftops." To them, it was not merely scripture, but a threat, a reminder that hidden chambers and guarded silence were never impenetrable. The whisper had not been contained by walls, nor by circuits. It had already reached beyond their control, and though they tried to cover it, the prophecy hung over them like a sword. Documents were unsealed, codes reviewed, strategies debated, but none of their actions quieted the unease. For in the deepest part of the chamber was the realization that power was never theirs to command. They were stewards of something older, guardians of a secret they could not rewrite. The whisper had awakened it, and the silence that followed was not safety, but judgment. Still, they pressed forward, desperate to decide their next move, unaware that the more they schemed, the more they revealed. For beyond the chamber, unseen eyes had already begun to watch, and ears had already begun to listen. And what those eyes sought was not the president nor his advisors, but the one whose name had shattered the illusion of control. The explanation given to the public was simple, wrapped in polished words and delivered with a calm face. A glitch, a misfire, nothing to question. But those who had seen the moment unfold in real time knew better. They had seen his hand move, not to calm the crowd, not to adjust his notes, but toward a small device hidden within the podium. A movement too subtle for most, yet clear enough for those who knew what to look for. With a single press, the broadcast had ended, the silence cascading across every screen like a carefully rehearsed command. The device was old, older than his administration, older than the technology it controlled. Its origin was buried under classified archives, its function known only to a select few. To use it was to cross an unspoken boundary, a line that even those at the highest levels feared to breach. It was never meant for public events, never meant to be activated under the world's gaze. Its purpose was simple and absolute: to silence. And that night, he chose to use it, not for national security, not for a threat from outside, but for a single whispered name. Advisors later questioned him, their words careful, their eyes sharp. Why now? Why then? His only response was silence, a gaze that revealed both defiance and dread. To speak would have been to admit that the name carried a weight heavier than policy, heavier than power itself. The signal he sent that night was not only to the cameras, but to those watching from behind them, to forces unseen, yet fully aware. The broadcast was cut, but another message was delivered in its place, a message to those who knew what the silence meant. The public moved on quickly, distracted by headlines and staged reassurances, but those who understood the signal felt the shift ripple through every hidden network. It was as if the president himself had declared allegiance, not to his people, not to his nation, but to something beyond the stage. And within the silence, those who had long waited recognized that the moment they had prepared for was beginning to unfold. The question that lingers is not whether the president silenced the feed, but who he was signaling to when he pressed that forbidden device, and what response now waits in the shadows. The corridors beyond the chamber were dimly lit, lined with figures who moved like shadows themselves, silent and deliberate. These were not elected officials or familiar faces from the stage of politics, but those who remained unseen, the ones who guided decisions from behind curtains the public would never touch. They gathered after the blackout, their whispers carrying the tension of men and women who knew that what had been spoken could not be erased. Among them was a fear unspoken, not only of exposure but of prophecy. For the name uttered by the president was not foreign to their records. It had been carried in hushed documents, coded messages, and sealed archives for generations. One of the elder figures leaned upon a cane, his voice rough with age, repeating words from long ago. "They tried to silence him too," he said, invoking a name not welcome in that place, Yeshua. The others stiffened at the mention, for to them, his name was not comfort, but reminder. A reminder that even the most powerful councils had failed to bury the truth, that even sealed tombs had opened when his voice broke the silence of history. The echo of his teachings haunted them, for he had warned that nothing spoken in secret would remain hidden. In the quiet that followed, they debated what must be done. Some argued for immediate erasure, the cleansing of every trace of the broadcast, while others feared that the act itself would draw more suspicion. Yet all of them knew that what had been spoken carried a resonance they could not smother. To silence your name was to admit its power, and to let it spread was to risk the collapse of the order they had built from the shadows. They recalled the old texts, the warnings that a time would come when truth would speak through unexpected voices, when names forgotten by the world would shake the foundations of empires. It was not the president they feared, nor the broadcast, but the possibility that prophecy was unfolding in real time. And as the council murmured, the elder who had spoken of Yeshua's memory looked upward, his eyes fixed on a point unseen. "The light always finds a way through," he whispered, a phrase that unsettled those around him more than silence itself, for they knew that if he was right, the shadows they trusted would not hold forever. The control room where the broadcast was managed had been designed like the heart of a machine. Glowing monitors stacked floor to ceiling, voices moving through headsets with military precision. On ordinary nights, every feed was cataloged, every frame stored, nothing lost to the silence of empty space. But on the night the president whispered your name, those in the control room watched in disbelief as their entire system blinked out at once. The hum of machinery died. The screens collapsed into black, and the silence was not the silence of malfunction, but of command. Technicians scrambled, their hands flying across keyboards, eyes wide with panic as though they had witnessed a ghost pass through their circuits. Protocols existed for almost every imaginable disruption, yet none applied to what had just occurred. They tried to force the feeds back, to override whatever had seized control, but the systems did not respond. It was as if the room itself had been cut off from the world beyond, sealed by an authority higher than any switch they could flip. When the lights finally returned, the staff found the archives blank. The segment of the broadcast that had just ended was missing, erased not in fragments, but as though it had never been recorded at all. The gap could not be explained, nor could it be patched. They were left with silence where history should have been, a silence that screamed louder than the footage it replaced. The operators exchanged nervous glances, knowing instinctively that what they had just witnessed was not a failure of machines, but a rewriting of reality itself. Supervisors demanded reports, demanded answers, demanded scapegoats. Yet behind the voices of authority lingered the same unspoken thought. The blackout had not been caused from within. Something greater had passed through their walls, silencing their tools, erasing their records, leaving nothing but questions. Some swore they still heard it, faintly when the room was quiet. The whisper carried on a frequency their machines could not capture, lingering in the space between sound and silence. Others dismissed it as nerves, a trick of the mind, but the look in their eyes betrayed doubt. For the room where the screens went dark had not simply failed. It had been chosen as the stage for a moment that could never be forgotten. Deep within the archives of the nation, in a vault secured by more locks than any treasury, lies a collection of texts and artifacts few have ever seen. These are not relics of wealth, but of knowledge, fragments of prophecy, warnings written in ancient tongues, and seals that bind them from reaching the world. After the broadcast was cut, whispers carried through the highest offices that the vault had been consulted. The name spoken had stirred memories of something long hidden, something guarded not by soldiers but by fear. Among the seals is one that has never been broken. It bears an inscription etched so finely into stone that even the passing of centuries has not worn it away. Translations differ, but the essence remains. A voice will come, and when it is spoken aloud, silence will follow until truth is revealed. To the keepers of power, this inscription is more curse than promise, a reminder that control is fragile, and silence cannot last forever. It was within this context that one advisor, older than most, dared to recall a teaching attributed to Yeshua. He reminded them that Yeshua once said, "If they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." The words lingered heavily, for in the chamber of sealed artifacts, the stones themselves seemed to breathe with restrained memory. What if the silence they engineered could not hold? What if the very structures around them bore witness, waiting for the appointed moment to break their seal? Fear is a powerful motivator, and those who served the unseen council knew they were running out of time. They debated whether to destroy the sealed texts, to erase even the memory of their existence. But the thought chilled them, for they understood that to break the seal themselves would be to fulfill the prophecy they dreaded. To leave it untouched was to risk its awakening at the sound of a name. The president's whisper had not only exposed the hidden networks of power, but had also rattled the foundations of a silence that had endured for centuries. And as they left the chamber that night, each one carried the weight of an unspoken realization. The seal would not remain closed forever. The night stretched long in the palace, the air heavy with the residue of silence that still clung to every hallway. The president retreated from the chamber, his steps slow, his posture burdened, as though the act of whispering your name had taken more from him than any public speech ever had. Those closest to him noticed the difference, the absence of confidence in his stride, the way his eyes avoided the portraits of past leaders that lined the walls. It was as if he knew they too were watching, silently condemning the choice he had made. When the doors closed behind him, he was left alone in the private quarters where no advisors dared follow. It was here, in the stillness, that he allowed himself to speak again, not to the cameras, not to the public, but into the shadows themselves. His lips moved softly, repeating the name as though invoking it, not once, but 3 times, as if each repetition carried him deeper into something unseen. The microphones had been cut, the systems disabled, but even without wires or screens, the name seemed to travel, resonating through the air like a low vibration that refused to fade. Those stationed outside the doors reported hearing nothing but a faint hum, a sound that made the walls themselves feel alive. Some guards shifted uncomfortably. Others crossed themselves in silence, yet none dared open the doors. They knew that authority had shifted in that moment, that the man behind the walls was no longer speaking as a leader of nations, but as a vessel for something beyond his control. The whisper was not merely his own. It carried with it an authority that seemed borrowed, as though he had tapped into a current far greater than his own voice. And when he stopped, when silence once again swallowed the room, he did not emerge at once. Hours passed, and still he remained behind closed doors, the weight of his final whisper echoing far beyond the palace. Those who later entered found him seated in the dim light, his eyes open but distant, as though he had seen something he could not put into words. He rose slowly, no longer burdened by hesitation, but with a clarity that frightened those who looked upon him, for they sensed that whatever he had whispered in that chamber was not finished, and the authority behind it had only just begun to speak. Beneath the surface of government, and beyond the reach of any constitution, sits a council that few have ever witnessed. They do not gather in parliaments or senates, nor do they raise their hands for votes. Their decisions are made in silence, their influence stretching across nations like unseen threads pulling at the fabric of history. When the president spoke your name and silenced the broadcast, it was to them the signal was truly sent, for it is the council that interprets whispers, measures shadows, and decides which truths are too dangerous for the light. The chamber where they met that night was carved not of marble or steel, but of secrecy itself. No cameras were present, no microphones hummed. They spoke softly, their words more dangerous than any weapon, for what they carried were not opinions but verdicts. The name spoken had been recorded in their archives for generations, guarded as a warning, a thread tied to prophecies that reached far beyond politics. Some at the table feared it was time, others denied it, clinging to the belief that control could still be maintained. But all of them understood the weight of the moment. They had heard this before, in echoes of scripture, in the warnings of prophets who refused to be silenced. One voice among them rose, calm but cutting, reminding the others of a truth they wished to forget. He quoted the words of Yeshua, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." The irony was not lost on them, for freedom was the very thing they had labored to restrain. To them, those words were not comfort but a threat, a reminder that no counsel, no power, no authority could hold back what was destined to be revealed. The room fell silent, each figure retreating into thought. They had built systems to erase, to censor, to bury anything that threatened their design. But the whisper of a single name had undone their illusion of control. And if the prophecy was true, if Yeshua's words still carried across centuries, then their unseen power was already unraveling. The president had played his role, but the council knew this was not the end. It was only the opening move in a game far greater than any of them could contain. Somewhere beyond their chamber, unseen forces were already stirring, preparing for the moment when secrecy would collapse and truth would walk unrestrained into the light.